George, you've interviewed the Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, and also Torsten Bell, an economist who is almost certain to be a Labour MP. And we've also got an interview with Jeremy Corbyn by Oliver Eagleton about the battle in Islington North, where Corbyn is running as an independent against a Labour candidate. George, what do you think is interesting about the Corbyn fight, first of all?
Well, what's interesting about that fight, it's very rare for independents to win. Most of the time, it's the big parties have the advantage because they have the party machine and they have the data. But if you have a genuine personal following, you can pull off a victory. And Corbyn has been MP for Islington North since 1983. Obviously, his Labour leadership massively raised his profile and it has a degree of loyalty. But the polling on this shows it's going to be a close fight. That I think some assumed that Corbyn would walk this race. That was never going to be the case because, as I say, Labour
it's an uphill struggle with an independent candidate.
Advantages. And some close to Corbyn are worried actually that people don't realise he's not the Labour candidate. Because the switch came relatively late in the sense it wasn't until the campaign that he was actually expelled from Labour. They're genuinely worried that some people might just tick the Labour box out of habit. But what makes it significant is that if he does win, it will create a different atmosphere in Parliament because you will still have that radical left figurehead. If Labour take that seat, then they will be able to simply move on from him. If they don't, and he's there in Parliament and still out campaigning as an MP, he will haunt Labour. It will be a permanent reminder of the divisions of the last 5 years.
I thought it would be fascinating to have Corbyn in the magazine. You know, as I said to you at the beginning, we're unpredictable and we're heterodox, and it's a very interesting piece by Oliver. He's been out on the road with him in Islington, and Oliver's asking him, what was that all about? That kind of, he calls it a radical left populist moment. Extraordinary number of votes for Corbyn in 2017, obviously lost in 2019. But he also, in the way Farage has, he also unlocked something very powerful in 2015. And a lot of young people in particular responded. You know, he unequivocally rejected austerity and he rejected the political status quo and the timidity of Labour as it was. And, you know, in some ways, George is right. He continues to haunt the party and the left, and he still has a following. And there's something poignant about it. Here he is, age 75, still fighting, still agitating, still going out on the street. And we've called it Corbyn's last stand, and it may well be. But what Corbyn says in the piece is, even if I'm defeated, the forces that I represent won't be defeated. You know, they come again. He's an internationalist. He references what's going on in Latin America. He's encouraged by recent elections in Mexico and in Brazil. And he thinks there's still a big constituency for the kind of politics he represents. So it makes for an interesting mix of pieces in the magazine this week.
Yeah, and in an election where we know the end result,
we know the result
already,
Rachel,
that right. Seat is really interesting because, as George says, no one knows which way it's going to go. George, you've also interviewed Jonathan Reynolds, Shadow Business Secretary, in a piece that kind of captures how Labour has changed its attitude to business and the economy since the Corbyn era. Why did you choose to interview him? Why did you think he was an interesting figure?
I think first, as you say, because the new marriage between Labour and business, as we call it, really is striking. That attitudes towards the party have been transformed in just a single term. That's partly because the Conservatives have provided business with plenty of excuses to metaphorically defect. Not just Liz Truss, but Boris Johnson, F Business, and polls of executives show they're mainly backing Labour. Tickets to the party's business day sell out at the speed of sort of Taylor Swift tickets. Now, I think some of this is just wanting to get close to the next government, but there's a genuine alignment on planning reform. The Conservative Party have been desperately sort of cautious and feeble on planning reform when one of the things the country needs to grow the economy is to get building again. But why is Jonathan Reynolds interesting? Well, he spearheaded this. He's trusted in the city, but he's also got an interesting personal story, which we discussed. So describes himself as a Christian socialist, chair of Christians on the left, one of the few Christians in the new cabinet in waiting.
He comes from a very working class background, like other members of the shadow cabinet, which is unusual even for Labour, right?
Yes, working class comes back in the northeast, and as you say, there are many of them: Wes Streeting, Bridget Phillipson, Starmer himself, David Lammy. That gives them a degree of it gives them a class consciousness. They're class aware. It's not class war, because it's not antagonistic, but they have a heightened awareness of class inequalities, which continue through British life. And you see that alignment of the sort of personal and political with the stance they've taken on private schools and levying VAT on them. Reynolds, interestingly, father of 4, had his first son at the age of 22. He's severely autistic, and one thing those close to me said is that explains his very even temperament. He's often described as one of the nicest people in politics. And when you've had an experience like that, becoming a father at a young age, difficult circumstances, I think you realise that you don't get too het up over small day-to-day things in politics. You know that life is complicated and hard, and that, I think, gives him sort of kindness as well.
He's a very decent man, I agree, yeah.
The class element and the background element of this new cabinet is going to be fascinating. So Reynolds, I learned from your piece, his father was a fireman, his mother was a dinner lady. You've also got the flagship interview in this edition, which is David Lammy, who also has a background in Tottenham that encapsulates a lot of the trends around class and globalisation and sort of social mobility. Jason, you went on the road with him around both Tottenham and the US. Yeah. What's he like? What's at the heart of David Lammy?
Yeah, he's a fascinating figure, David, which is why I wanted to write about him and travel with him. We went to Washington, and he's in opposition, no money, no entourage. Going with David to Washington, travelling around town in Ubers, it was a hectic trip. But what he was trying to do on that trip was build relationships with the Republicans. So he was trying to lay the ground for what might happen in the autumn and a Trump presidency. David's an interesting figure. He was never part of the radical London left, like Diane Abbott, who he likes and respects, or Bernie Grant, who he succeeded in Tottenham. He's presented originally as a kind of Blairite moderniser, as a young MP. But he's moved over the years. He would call himself a communitarian. When I was in Washington with him, he knew his audience. He called himself a good Christian boy and a conservative.
Small c conservative.
Yeah, small c conservative, Rachel. But some say, look, the criticism of David Lammy is a shapeshifter. He would say, look, when the facts change, I change my mind. But he's got a really interesting concept for foreign policy, what he's calling progressive realism. He understands the world is the shifts in geopolitics have created a world order completely different from when Blair won power in 1997. He accepts that progress isn't inevitable. The arc of history doesn't bend towards justice and enlightenment. This is now a multipolar world. The global south is a powerful bloc. China, Russia, India as this huge balancing power, and he's trying to adapt to the world as it is, rather than the world as liberals or the left wish it to be, which I find a very interesting concept. At the very end of the piece, he speaks to me about his father, who left the family when David was 12, died in poverty, an alcoholic in America. Very, very sad story about his father. Recently, David was at the Trooping the Colour celebrations. I think he was a guest of Alistair Jack, the Scottish secretary, and he was on Jack's terrace. And Lammy said that Boris Johnson was there, James Cleverly was there, and other sort of senior Conservatives were there. And he found the atmosphere trivial and frivolous. They were kind of demob happy, he said. And it occurred to him that these were the kind of wrong class of people for the times in which we're living. They weren't serious. And these are serious times. The implication, of course, is that
he's the right class.
Starmer's people are the right class. But I think George had it here. They're really interesting. The high command in the shadow cabinet, soon to be the cabinet. Rachel Reeves, Angela Rayner, Bridget Phillipson, working class, daughter of a single mother, went to Oxford. Starmer himself, we always hear about his difficult upbringing. Very interesting upbringings of kind of economic or psychological hardship, single mothers, separated parents, state schools. They're a particular class of people.
People who are a lot closer to the ways in which the state has failed parts of society than previous cabinets, even previous Labour cabinets.
I think so, Rachel. But also meritocratic, getting to succeed, riding that educational escalator, some of them to Oxbridge. Angela Rayner certainly not. I mean, she leaves school at 16 and rises through the trade union movement. But they weren't born into kind of what I would call the bourgeois liberal left. They weren't born into Hampstead and Highgate and Islington, the way Labour people are often caricatured as being a middle class.
Red princes.
Like the Miliband brothers or Hilary Benn or middle class liberals. Their background's actually closer to my own. Out in Harlow Newtown. So, they're an interesting group. They're a serious group. They're grappling with big problems both in this country and in the world. I mean, Rachel Reeves has declared the end of liberal globalisation. David Lammy, in his piece with me this week, is declaring the end of the post-colonial era. These are huge statements. What do they mean exactly? What do they mean by them? We'll soon find out because they're going to be in power. So I think for the New Statesman, these really are interesting new times. And our role, I think, as ever, is to try and understand, explain, and analyse them.
George, you wrote a piece on Starmerism, what is Starmerism, quite recently, and one of the key planks or pillars of Starmerism was this idea of progressive realism. What do you think that means in practice for British foreign policy? I think it's quite interesting and surprising, will be surprising to some, that Lamy was on this trip meeting key Republicans, people who he thinks would be integral in Donald Trump's second administration, when he was incredibly vocally anti-Trump at the start, and also calling for a second referendum pretty much immediately afterwards, very anti-Brexit. How does that all fit with what Labour's foreign policy seems to be now?
Well, how Lamy's just described it to me at the start of the year is it's about progressive ends and realist means. So the realism is you take the world as it is, but you have this overriding, as Jason says in his piece, commitments to climate diplomacy, unambiguous commitment to international law and human rights. But you're pragmatic about how you achieve that. So you don't simply say, we're going to declare Saudi Arabia an absolute pariah, we're going to have nothing to do with them. Because if you want better outcomes in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is an important partner and player in that. So you're pragmatic about the balance of power. It means that, of course, you're going to have a dialogue of pressure with China over human rights. But does anyone think that you can meaningfully tackle climate change if you're not prepared to discuss the issue with China in a reasonable way? So it's about recognizing that not every country is going to have the system and values that you would wish. But if you want to achieve a better world, then you have to treat them with a degree of respect and pragmatism.
It's also about where interests align as well. So foreign policy, what is in the national interest, and also what is in the interest. You create a foreign policy, it's in the interest of the social and economic needs of the British people. So there's a sort of fundamental patriotism to it. And stop lecturing people, stop being so pious and self-righteous, and work with what you find, the geopolitics as they are and the world as it is. And in my piece, I go back to Ben Rhodes' book, which is about his time working as a speechwriter for Obama, and it's a journey he takes from idealism to a kind of disenchantment at the end of the Obama years. And Obama turns to Rhodes at one point at the end when Trump's about to become president and said, what if we were wrong? And that's a question liberals don't ask themselves enough. What if we were wrong? What did we misunderstand about the world as it is?